just for anyone listening, that dog barking in the background is the neighbor's dog. That is not our dog, and we do not have the ability to have the dog stop barking.
Anyways, welcome to episode 1.
I'm Peter.
I am Rena, and
today we're talking about Nashville.
Yes, episode 1 is about Nashville. So, how these episodes are going to go, I am going to tell Peter a ghost story.
And I will tangent wildly.
Okay, ghost stories and tangents.
So what do you have today?
So, today, since our theme was Nashville...
That is our cat, by the way. If you can hear anything on the audio or see a curtain moving behind if you're watching the video, our little cat has decided to run about.
So since our theme was Nashville, the story I wanted to start off with is kind of a big one, because just outside of Nashville is one of the most well-documented hauntings in American history.
Okay.
So 45 minutes from Nashville is Adams, Tennessee, and it is the center of one of the most well-documented hauntings in American history. Every year, thousands of people travel to Bell Witch Cave, which is allegedly home to the only spirit credited with haunting a person to death.
Ouch.
So, this story actually begins in 1804, when John and Lucy Bell moved from Edgecombe County, North Carolina, to Red River in Robertson County, and that is the area that will later become Adams.
Okay.
For the first 15 or so years that they live on the property, everything's pretty normal. They are planters, and they end up accruing about 300 acres of land, and they live there with their 6 children, John Jr., Jesse, Betsy, Richard, Drury, and Benjamin. They also, this family does own slaves. However, I could not find their names. This haunting begins in 1817, when the family starts noticing odd creatures on the property. And one day, John Bell, the patriarch of the family, is on his farm and notices a dog-like creature in the corn. And this creature has the body of a large black dog and the head of a rabbit.
A dog with big ears.
With rabbit ears.
Sounds kind of cute.
Well, anyways, he didn't think so because she shot at it.
Oh.
And he missed, and it vanished. He goes back home and he doesn't think anything of it for the rest of the evening, and the family has dinner and they go to bed. But that night, they're woken up by the sound of something beating on the walls of their house. They run outside to investigate and catch whoever's doing it, and there is nothing there. But this beating continues all night. And it comes back again the next night, and it gets louder, and the next night, and every night it's escalating. Something is tapping on the house, something is beating on the house, there's scratching noises, and every time they try to catch whoever or whatever is doing it, there's nothing there. So as this escalates, one night it moves into the house. And the children wake up their parents saying that there is something chewing on their bed. They're also hearing more tapping, the sounds of scratching on their floors and their walls and their furniture, the sounds of animals fighting, chains dragging, and it's also accompanied by a faint voice that they can't quite make out. Sometimes the voice is talking, sometimes the voice is humming. The activity is very focused on the youngest child, Betsy, and it begins violently attacking her. She's waking up with handprints and bruising all over her body. And the voice begins to grow stronger. And it appears to be a female voice. It's singing hymns and reciting scripture. And it would also say that it intended to kill John Bell. The Bells kept this a secret. John Bell was an elder in the church, so they didn't really want it getting out that they had a disembodied voice and they were being attacked. So for a while they dealt with this on their own, but finally John Bell confided in his neighbor and best friend, James Johnston. The Johnstons didn't really believe them at first, but James and his wife stayed a night with the Bells to see what would happen. And they were woken up by the same tapping and scratching and something pulling the covers off the bed. James was also being hit and had marks on his body.
Oh dear.
And it seems like the more attention that they gave the entity, the more powerful that it would become, because it began speaking in full sentences. It began having full conversations with members of the family, no matter where they were on the property. And this voice would sound different. It would mimic other people. Sometimes it would talk to multiple people at the same time. And it also starts affecting other people in the town. At one point, it repeated word for word 2 sermons given at the exact same time, 13 miles apart. At this point, reverends are coming to try and communicate with it and find out why it's there. At one point, it does claim to be Kate Batts' witch, and that is how the entity got the name Kate. Kate Batts was a member of the community. She ran her and her husband's farm, and she's described as unusual. A lot of ways that this story is told, she had a land dispute with the Wells, and so she cursed them. I personally don't think that's what happened, because it sounds like that's just some misogyny getting in there, because if she was described as an unusual person, then it's just that going back to that old the strange woman is the witch trope.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, John Bell Sr.'s health is declining, and he's getting mouth sores, and he's having partial facial paralysis. He's having trouble swallowing. He's having seizures. And this whole time the entity is mocking him and laughing at him and stealing things from him and just overall making his life very difficult. It's continuously saying that John Bell is a bad man. Supposedly, they did ask the entity why it wanted to kill him, and according to the family, it answered, but we don't know what that answer is.
Okay.
John Bell did have some shady business practices. At one point during this, he is excommunicated from his church for one of these shady business practices that involved the sale of an enslaved person. It's also worth noting that when John and Lucy got married, John was in his 30s and Lucy was 12.
Okay.
There's also a rumor that John left North Carolina because he had murdered an overseer.
Okay.
So one of the theories is that the entity is the disgruntled spirit of the person that he murdered. So while the spirit is still tormenting John, it's also very concentrated on Betsy throughout her adolescence. At the same time, the entity is very kind to Lucy, the wife, and it'll sing to her and it'll bring her gifts and
That's nice of it.
Yeah, and it says that she is like the greatest creature that ever was. Meanwhile, it's beating her daughter. As more and more people are hearing about the entity, more and more people are showing up to investigate or to try and banish it. At one point, one of the investigators asks who the spirit is, and the voice responds, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy, but I have been disturbed and made unhappy. I am the spirit of a person who was buried in the woods nearby, and the grave was disturbed, my bones disinterred and scattered." Another one of the theories is there were burial mounds in this area and on the Wells property. Mm-hmm. So, of course, that gets scapegoated a lot as well. The witch was also particularly cruel to an enslaved person named Dean. So Dean had been enslaved by the Bells. I couldn't find a lot of records on him, but it seems like he moved from North Carolina with them, so he'd been there a long time. Okay. He reported being stalked by a black dog with 2 heads, being attacked by a rabbit, and eventually he started trying to carry protection charms with him, and the entity would just take them and destroy them. So just nothing was keeping him safe. According to the legend, at one point the entity turned him into a mule, and it proclaimed it was so that it could ride him to hell for breakfast.
That is quite the story. Poor Dean.
Yeah, poor Dean. I don't know what happened. I don't know if they turned him back or I'm really alarmed by that part. One of the people who stopped by to investigate the farm and the entity came in saying that he was very skeptical, and at one point he starts talking about his family overseas, and the voice suddenly begins to mimic his parents, who are in England.
Okay.
And then again, early in the morning, he's woken up to the voice of his own parents, worried because they had heard his voice in a well in back of their home. So somehow this entity is speaking to him, mimicking his parents' voice in Middle Tennessee, and simultaneously mimicking his voice in a well in England. So he quickly leaves and later sends a letter from his family home in England apologizing to the Bells for his skepticism. Another person who tried to test the witch was John Johnston, who is the son of James, the man who stayed overnight. So he tried to come up with something that no one outside of his family would know. And he asked the entity what his step-grandmother in North Carolina would say to the enslaved people if she thought that they did something wrong. And the entity replied, with his grandmother's Dutch accent, "Hut tut, what has happened now?" One of the more famous visitors to the farm was Andrew Jackson.
Okay. Yeah, he was down in Hermitage. Okay.
So he actually served with John Bell and his brothers at the Battle of New Orleans. So when he heard of the haunting, he, of course, wanted to check it out. So he brought a team to investigate. And as they approached the property, their wagon became stuck. And no matter what they did, they could not budge it.
Okay.
And finally, Jackson announced, "By the eternal boys, that must be the Bell Witch." The voice responded, "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you again tonight." And then the wagon started moving.
Oh, I thought he was going to make a speech about running for president, improving the roads.
Not in Tennessee. So one member of Jackson's party begins to boast that the witch won't bother them because the witch is scared of a silver bullet that he has. So he's talking a big game and boasting and just talking about how brave he is and how many witches he's killed. Eventually, I guess the witch just gets tired of it because she just starts beating him.
Yeah, I empathize.
At one point, she physically throws him out the door. So to everyone looking, it would have him just fighting with nothing because no one can see her. He gets thrown out the door by nothing. So all of the men are scared at this point. They want to leave. And Andrew Jackson says, no, he's gonna stay.
Okay.
And they all have to stay with him because the voice has said that before the night is over, it will reveal another fraud in his party.
Okay.
No one really knows what happened next, but they left in the middle of the night.
Oh, so we don't know. So there's no record that Jackson was the fraud.
No, I personally like to think that Jackson was the fraud.
I believe it.
And that's why there's no records of him actually making this trip, that he just erased it because he was embarrassed.
Okay. Yeah, that's how I like the story to end, so that's how it will end for me.
It would be really embarrassing to run for president and it come out that a disembodied voice made a fool of you. It is said that Jackson proclaimed, "I would rather fight the British at New Orleans than fight the Bell Witch." So at this point, this haunting has been going on for 3 years. And this is 3 years of it just talking to the family, of it beating on the walls of the house at night, of it physically attacking Betsy Bell, who, by the way, in 1817 was 11 years old.
Okay.
And all this time, it is still saying that it intends to kill John Bell because John Bell is a bad man.
Okay.
So on December 20th of 1820, John Bell is found comatose in his bed. They found a vial of dark liquid near him, and they heard the entity's voice call out, "I gave old Jack a big old dose of that last night, which fixed him." Trigger warning, trigger warning. So, it being 1820, and apparently we don't care about anything, they tested the liquid in the vial on one of the farm cats. And,
Rude.
yeah, so the poor farm cat died within the hour. And John Bell died not too long after that. So they threw the vial in the hearth, and it erupted in a puff of black smoke. So this makes John Bell the only person in history whose death was attributed to supernatural forces. So when they had John Bell's funeral, it was, at the time, the largest funeral that had been had in Tennessee. And the entity was quiet throughout the funeral until the end, when she begins cackling and laughing and singing drinking songs. And she keeps that up until the last person leaves the gravesite. So as the family is trying to recover from this, Betsy Bell, who is now a teenager, has begun courting Joshua Gardner, who is a prominent member of the community. They have their parents' blessing to get married. The only problem is the entity is constantly following them around and telling Betsy not to marry Joshua.
Okay.
It is relentless in that. Sometimes it's telling Betsy very graphic, salacious things to embarrass her. And Betsy and Joshua are never really alone because the entity is always there ridiculing them. And now that the entity has seemingly murdered her father, she's worried about her safety, because remember, this thing is still violent, like it's still hitting her and like violently attacking her. So now she's worried about her safety and she's worried about Joshua's safety. So with those concerns, unfortunately, in the spring of 1821, Betsy Bell ends her engagement to Joshua Gardner. That same spring, the witch seems to have done everything she was going to do. And she visits Lucy and says, "I'm leaving.
Okay.
But I'll be back in 7 years."
Okay.
So everything is quiet for 7 years until 1828, when the entity returns and the beating on the house and the scratching, all of that starts up again.
Okay.
And then it seems like it mostly visited John Bell Jr. And according to some sources, it was 3 weeks. According to some sources, it was 3 days. So he and the entity just kind of hang out and they discuss spiritualism, Christianity, a spiritual awakening in the country, the beginning of life, philosophy.
Okay.
So they're just hanging out. They're just chatting.
Okay.
The voice then predicted the Civil War.
He's just chatting with the thing that supposedly killed his dad.
Yeah.
He was also nice to his mom.
Yeah. And beat his little sister a lot.
Yeah, beat his little sister.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Broke up her marriage, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's just chatting.
Okay.
It's cool. It's fine. It then accurately predicts the Civil War and several other things. I don't know what they are. It just said Civil War.
Okay.
And it predicts that the world will end in a great fire. Then it says, this has been fun. I'm going to visit your direct descendant in 107 years.
So I guess the world has to end over 107 years after that, which has been past that now. But
yeah,
didn't give a date. Didn't give a date
no.
on this Inferno. Oh.
No, I don't know how. I don't know if it was just. I don't know. I don't know how well you could guess that the Civil War was going to happen in 1828. But yep. So this story was passed down orally for many years in the area until 1894, and that's when the account was first published in An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch, written by Martin Van Buren Ingram, and he used the journal of Richard Bell, which was titled Our Family Trouble. Richard Bell was the youngest of the children, so when the haunting started, he was maybe 5 or 6.
Okay.
So he wrote his account 30 years after the fact about the events in his childhood.
Okay.
So that is the first. Oh my god. Sorry, Minerva. Minerva scared me so bad.
I saw her walking up to you as well. I didn't know if I should say something, but she was very into the story, so I just let her keep walking.
Oh, sorry. All of a sudden, there was just something touching my hand, and it was our cats. Oh, my heart is racing. That scared me so bad. So in 1935 is 107 years from when the witch last said she would make an appearance.
Okay.
The Bells did have a direct descendant living in Nashville at that time, and he was Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, John Bell Sr.'s great-grandson. He is a neurologist living in Nashville. He was a neurologist living in Nashville.
Okay.
He actually published a book in 1934 about his family's ordeal with the Bell Witch. But then there was no word in 1935 if the voice came to him.
Okay.
So we don't know if she ever came back, but a lot of the family members will say that she never left because descendants of the Bells to this day say that they have interactions with her.
Okay.
So the property that was once owned by the Bells is now in Adams, Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
It's said that the spirit actually retreated into Bell Witch Cave on the property. You can actually go tour this cave. It is currently owned by Chris and Walter Kirby, and they report seeing strange things in the woods, orbs of light, disembodied voices. People who visit will take pictures of the trees and go back and notice humanoid figures standing in the tree line.
Has anyone seen a dog with a rabbit head, though? Because I want to hear more about that thing.
I did watch a video where someone was out there talking about it, and as soon as he got to that part of the story, a black dog just runs around the house into the... It was pretty creepy. People report hearing a little girl giggling and seeing a little girl in a blue dress running around in the cave. People report being hit and scratched, and it seems like if you go and denounce the Bell Witch or say you don't believe in her, then she'll attack you.
Okay.
The current owners of the property, Chris and Walter Kirby, actually wrote a book about the property called The Bell Witch, The Truth Exposed. They published that in 2008. I have not read it, but I would like to, so just Christmas list, maybe. Oh, also, it said if you take anything from the cave, you'll have bad luck. And the Kirbys say that every year they get tons of rocks and pebbles mailed back to them from people who have taken it and then had a string of bad luck. They have a letter on their website of a mother who wrote in saying that their daughter took a stone and then did not tell anyone. Mm-hmm. And then finally came back to her parents and said, I've had the worst luck for months. Please send this back.
Do people ever take these stones and, like, leave it in the house of someone who they don't like? That'd be such a rude move. That'd be so rude.
Also, one time a woman took something on a tour and then came back, and apparently she had been in an accident leaving, so she immediately brought the stone back.
Oh.
And I just want to leave you with this review of the cave. This is not a review, this is a warning. Folks, please make sure not to take anything home from the Bell Witch Cave, or there will be consequences. The Bell Witch is not a ghost, a poltergeist, or a demon. She is a fallen angel. She will be around for a long, long time. As of now, September 2021, the Bell Witch Cave is closed for apocalypse reasons. Panorama reasons. Okay. They do not say when they will be reopening, but hopefully soon, because I kind of want to go.
Oh, okay. Are you going to take anything?
No, I will not take anything.
No. You're going to take anything and then mail it to an unsuspecting...
No, because what if the witch knows and then haunts me instead? What if she's like, yeah, you're not going to get me that way?
Yeah, I guess this is a smart entity. It was talking all kinds of...
Yeah.
It was talking philosophy and...
What if it, like, opens up this weird, like, telephone thing and I can hear the person that I tried to mail this pebble to the whole time, and they can hear me, and now we're kind of stuck with each other forever.
Yeah. That'd be a funny sitcom. I would watch that sitcom.
It is very niche. Okay. So that's the Bell Witch Cave.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, sorry, we're back. It's a new day. Because our downstairs neighbor decided that midnight on a Wednesday would be an awesome time to start playing the organ and scream singing. And I wish I was making that up. Apparently, we share a building with the Phantom of the Opera.
This is what happens when you live in Nashville.
No one prepared me for organ music.
All right, so
anyways.
Yes, my story kind of relates to yours in a lot of ways. Also has to do with the history of the area, and I think you'll see a fair number of crossovers actually in some places.
Fun.
I'm going to start it a little closer to home. I'm actually going to start it in the present day, about 2 miles west of Lower Broadway, where all the tourists jam into honky tonks. And I'm talking about Centennial Park.
Oh, okay. Okay. I don't know directions.
About 2 miles west of Lower Broadway in Nashville is Centennial Park. And if you go there today, first thing that you're probably going to notice is a scale replica of the Parthenon from ancient Greece. It was built for the Tennessee Centennial Exposition back in 1897. Set quite imposingly against the much smaller Lake Watauga in front of it.
That lake has a name?
Yes, it's called Lake Watauga.
I didn't know that.
It's named for a treaty that ceded this land to white settlers.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, fun. Okay, okay.
Yeah. And as you stare at it, it doesn't really speak anything verbally, but it seems to make a very bold claim as it's standing there. And
the lake or the Parthenon?
The Parthenon. The Parthenon makes quite a bold claim simply with its existence. And it seems to be saying that the history of Europe is the history of this land that we're on.
It is an odd placement to see a replica of the Parthenon in a park in Nashville, Tennessee. It is it's gaudy, like it's not cute.
Yeah. Actually, even more interestingly enough, you'll probably miss it because it's much smaller than the Parthenon, but set just a little way down Lake Watauga is a smaller stone obelisk. You probably won't notice it next to the derivative Greek fetish, but it's got an inscription on it, and it might make an even more bold claim. And it's a quote by the man credited with founding Nashville, Mr. James Robertson. And he is quoted on the statue as saying, in 1770, "We are the advance guard of civilization, and our way is across the continent." Quite.
Well, I'm sorry, who was he again?
Yeah, quite a bold claim for about civilization from someone who doesn't make it into world history textbooks. But actually, these two objects together, I think they're kind of interesting because when you think about it, they kind of actually mirror the narrative of history gets taught to American children, which is, in about the 5th century BC, civilization began. And then 2,500 years later, a civilized people without land came to a land without civilized people. Jumping a little bit back in time a year, so back in March 2020 last year, there was an EF3 tornado that moved across Middle Tennessee, tore through North Nashville, Germantown, East Nashville, before going on to Donaldson, Hermitage, and Mount Juliet. It was part of a larger storm system that went across all of Middle Tennessee, and ultimately it caused about $1.6 billion in damage, they estimate, and killed 25 people. It was a very tragic event. The thing that I want to mention about it is there are 3 popular culture misconceptions about tornadoes, and all 3 of those were actually disproved that day. So knowing these aren't true could potentially, keep you alive one day if you're in the path of a tornado. One is the misconception that tornadoes do not hit downtown areas. The second is the misconception that tornadoes do cross water because that tornado crossed the Cumberland River several times. And third is that tornadoes do not hit the same place twice. When you and I moved to Nashville back in 2016, several locals had told us about another tornado that had struck East Nashville back in 1998. Interestingly enough, when you draw the paths of these tornadoes onto an aerial photograph, these two, along with a third tornado from back in 1933, all actually intersect on the Five Points neighborhood in East Nashville, which is relatively near where we currently, Obviously, the damage for that remained for months, but media attention quickly shifted to the other global disaster that was starting to hit Western countries around that time.
Hit 1 week later. It was an eventful March 2020 over here.
My job remained closed for about a week, but when I went back, some of my older born and raised co-workers made an assertion that caught me a little off guard. They claimed that the land in East Nashville is defiled because it's built on top of an Indian burial ground. And I, scoffed at the idea. Besides the obvious meteorological explanation for why tornadoes hit this area so often, it seemed...
Well, that's the excuse for everything bad that happens in America, is everyone just throws out burial ground, and it's just a weird superstitious phenomenon that everyone scapegoats.
Yeah, plus we'd also lived here for several years at that point and knew not everything there was to know, but a decent amount about Nashville's history. And there's, a lot of signposts about, well, the Civil War and the local music industry and local genocidal maniac Andrew Jackson. Talk about indigenous burial grounds just kind of sounded like a prank that locals would play on, gullible transplants.
Yeah, they don't like us very much.
Yes, we drove up the housing costs here.
Joke's on us, we can't afford it either.
Nope. So I'm not fully prepared to say that I was wrong for doubting this explanation. Blaming supernatural phenomenon on indigenous curses can feel cheap compared to the true historical horror of having been one of the people who fought for years against unrelenting and deliberate government policy of ethnic genocide, one that so completely eradicated the history, peoples, and cultures from this land that to this day the Parthenon can stand in Centennial Park and claim to be an accurate and true history of the area without any sense of irony in the fact. But the thing is, today, you can actually still find remains of pre-contact environment on the periphery of Nashville. So Mound Bottoms, Castilian Springs, Sellers Mound, and Old Town, they lay just far outside enough of Nashville's urban sprawl to where that they were not demolished by highway engineers and land developers during the 20th century. If you visit today, most of what you'll see that remains are the raised earthen mounds. Sometimes they'll be covered by trees. These sites have not been well preserved. Deeper excavations from the mounds, though, have unearthed evidence of a larger complex built environment. They built astronomically aligned structures, and they created beautiful works of metal iconography that still exist to this day, and also buried their dead in large cemeteries in the area.
And how far away from downtown is it?
The largest of these is called Mound Bottom, and it's just west of the Bellevue area on the Harpeth River. Castilian Springs is going out past Gallatin. Sellers Mound is the smallest and least well preserved. It's in a fully forested area, but that is just around the Percy Priest Lake area.
Okay, so all of these are within 20, 25, maybe 30 minutes of like Broadway.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They're all easily, an afternoon visit from, the city center. Yeah.
Okay.
So I wanted to know who created this complex culture and what it would have been like to live there. And I wanted to know where the society came from and about when did it reach its golden age. Finally, I wanted to know, why did this civilization just seem to disappear beneath the trees, and how was it lost to us? I'm going to stop here, talk about the sources I was able to find. Because there's no known written language that survives from pre-contact peoples of modern-day North America, the accounts that we have come from Europeans, as well as the archaeological record and the oral traditions of surviving indigenous peoples to these days. The first Europeans to explore the area were under Hernando de Soto, but the 4 known accounts from this expedition often struggle to line up with the archaeological record. And in the early 20th century, some research teams, often from local universities, surveyed local sites. Frequently, they would dig into the mounds, looking for what they thought was probably buried treasure in there. And then, after not finding any, they would just seal the mounds back up again. However, after over a century of European occupation at this point, most of the sites had already been looted or vandalized by European settlers in the area. We can look at some of the 19th century's accounts. One of the earliest of these was by a man called John Haywood, who in 1823 published the Natural and Aboriginal History of Tennessee. And I'm going to have a quote from him later at the end of this. And so the lack of primary sources from original inhabitants is our biggest barrier. to understanding. And this creates a huge challenge when trying to see past a colonizer perspective on these cultures. And what we're left with, like I said, is the archaeological record and the oral history of surviving native peoples. And it's from these that I'm trying to piece together an accurate version of the truth. Now, I don't hold a degree in the field, and if anyone listening knows better than me on the matter, I would actually love to hear. And if anyone has better sources, I would love to know those, so please share. So for many years, the prevailing scientific Clovis first theory maintained that humans arrived in the Americas by crossing the Bering Land Bridge during low sea levels during the last ice age. They estimate about 13,000 years ago. More recent radiocarbon dating suggests that they arrived here much earlier. One of the oldest attested sites is the Coxclatan Cave in Mexico, estimated to have been occupied between 28 and 33,000 years ago. Genetic and linguistic analysis shows a relationship between modern indigenous peoples and current groups living in Siberia today. But also additionally, many symbols and motifs that appear in indigenous art also appear in Eurasia, including the hand and eye symbol you might be familiar with. It's also known as the Hamsa, appears in Middle Eastern as well as indigenous cultures. The solar cross and the swastika both appear in Eurasia and in the Americas. And a storytelling device based around the sacred twins, which appears in Native American folklore, but you also might think of stories like Romulus and Remus founding Rome, or like the Cain and Abel story from the Bible. These stories appear across both sides.
Okay.
So these first people that arrived also brought with them a seemingly universal human love of building upwards. Wherever that you go in the world, it seems like anytime people move from a migratory to more of a settled way of life, one of the first things they do is they just want to build something up in the air. Kind of a universal human concept.
I have to build a skyscraper. I've got to do it.
And of course, yeah.
It reminds me of that. This is such a tangent, but that reminds me about that big residential building in New York that's so tall that it sways in the wind, and some of the floors have to be like a wind tunnel so the air can pass through, and it's horrifying. Okay, I'm sorry, continue.
Actually, I heard the residents of those buildings actually just won a lawsuit because they just overpaid ridiculous sums of money because it's ridiculously expensive to live there, and then they were dealing with all these faulty utilities issues within the building.
I just they wanted to live that far in the air. I don't have tons of sympathy for them spending all that money so that they can live amongst the clouds. That's just wow.
It is excessive.
I love how the lawsuit was about faulty utilities and not about their entire apartment swaying in the wind.
I guess the building knew to include that in the fine print somewhere, but they didn't know to include that the elevator will periodically stop working for long periods of time.
Oh, that's horrifying. No. That's awful. Ew. Okay, I'm sorry. So humans want to build up to live in the clouds.
Yes, and
okay.
That tends to be the starting point for dating these first sites in the Americas, because it's easy to locate these mounds because they've survived the longest, and you can usually radiocarbon date some kind of organic material that was from within the fill. One of the oldest of these is the Monte Sano site in modern-day Baton Rouge, which dated back to the 5th millennium BC. So very, very old, predating the pyramids, predating Stonehenge. Unfortunately, it was leveled shortly thereafter for urban development.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, so, yes, stories of destroyed sites are going to be a common theme here. Especially in regards to burial sites, where legal protections for cemeteries have not historically existed for the black or indigenous dead the same way that they existed for the white dead. Yeah, so that's going to be a common theme going forward.
Okay, so your half of the podcast is just going to be really depressing. Should we switch? Should I tell ghost story second?
Well, we'll see how it works. Since this is the first one, we'll see how it flows together. We can make adjustments in the future.
Okay, so they found something older than Stonehenge, and we're just like, I'm gonna build a target?
Pretty much.
Okay,
pretty
all right,
much,
cool.
yeah. One of the most famous so-called archaic sites is Poverty Point. Now, this culture flourished between the 18th and 14th centuries BCE in the lower Mississippi Valley. Predated ancient Greece by 1,000 years, and in many ways the civilization compares to concurrent Bronze Age River Valley civilizations when you think Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, or ancient China in terms of its size and scale. It stretched 100 miles in both directions up and down the Mississippi River with over 100 smaller satellite settlements that have been identified. The culture's center at Poverty Point was massive. It was built around a 37-acre central plaza, and it was surrounded by 7.5 miles of concentric earthen rings on a total 345-acre site. Many mounds dot the site, the largest which is 72 feet tall and is aligned east-west with the sun. And then there was a large circular structure that they found remains of on the site that would have marked important calendar dates and seasons similar to Stonehenge. We don't know the name these inhabitants call themselves, and today the site is named for the local plantation, which irreparably damaged the ring structures by plowing the area for 150 years. But in North America, it seems like the mound building reached its zenith during the period now called the Mississippian, which began around the year 800. For comparison, around that same time in Western Europe, it was when the surviving fragments of Roman civilization, which were then ruled by Germanic kings, were coming under attack by Vikings, who liked to pillage sacred sites across the continent for gold, murder and enslave the inhabitants who lived there, and establish new colonies to facilitate in their trade of stolen goods and human lives. Once settled in their new lands, the Norse gave rise to many of the modern European noble classes that we think of, who ruled over their peasant underclass. This very dark time in human history kind of serves us as a bit of a preview for what's about to come later on when the kings and queens descended from those Vikings decided to embark on a global pillaging. It's since been called the Age of Colonization. But back in North America, as the land would later be called, the people embarked on a period of prosperity. The following centuries would see unprecedented urbanization and trade, advances in the form of heated metalworking called annealing, which created countless pieces of art, and they radiated outward from an area called the American Bottom, which is at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. It was a strategic site because from there you could go up and downstream. You could connect to the Kansas River, taking you out towards the Rocky Mountains. Obviously, the Mississippi went north and south. The Ohio River stretched up into the Appalachians, and branching off from the Ohio River were the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. It was following these paths along the Cumberland River, which is where the mound builders of the Nashville area began to settle. They brought with them the culture of the largest city at the time in North America, which was called Cahokia. I believe I pronounced that correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. Its remains today lie across the river from modern St. Louis in Illinois. Cahokia was the largest pre-Columbian city in North America. It likely had a larger population than London during the 13th century, which at the time had a population between 14 and 18,000 people. In fact, it's probably the largest city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it, when Philadelphia reached a population of 40,000 people much later on. It was once home to about 120 mounds. It also boasted the largest man-made structure in North America. This structure was later named Monk's Mound by a U.S. congressman, because when you're elected to Congress, you just get to do things like that, I guess. and its base is roughly the same size as the Great Pyramid at Giza and slightly larger than the Pyramid of Sun in Teotihuacan. You can visit the site today, though only about 80 mounds remain. The rest were destroyed by road building, housing developments, and according to one source that I could find, some were demolished to create topsoil for local radish farmers.
Ugh.
Which in that case means that a World Heritage Site was vandalized so people could have horseradish.
I have no comment. That's horrifying.
So the area where Nashville is today was a very important strategic site for the Mississippian people. The land along the modern-day Cumberland River between the Stones River and Harpeth River allowed for relatively fast travel between the Ohio Valley, and from there you could go deep into Middle Tennessee. As the area started to urbanize, these new settlements that were built bore many similarities to Cahokia. This culture has been given the rather long-winded name Southeast Ceremonial Complex by scholars, but their culture...
That's the name of the site or the name of the people?
That is the name. So the Mississippian people in the Mississippian period, yes, referred to the Mississippian period, the religion and the culture is referred to the Southeast Ceremonial Complex.
That sounds like a mega church in Texas. Why would they name it that?
It does, doesn't it? But actually, the beliefs of these people probably quite similarly match the modern-day Natchez people. We know this because the Natchez were some of the few surviving peoples that were still building mounds after European contact. So, of course, without written records, interpretation of their belief system is often highly speculative, especially in regards to the purpose that these mounds served. We can infer things based on art, but probably the most effective way is to listen to the oral traditions of their surviving descendants. By doing this, you can pick up some common themes. Ingrained in their cosmology was a deep sense of dualism. They believed there was an overworld and an underworld connected by an axis mundi that was frequently depicted as a tree in art. Again, you can kind of notice some crossover similarities between Eurasian cultures and Native American cultures here. Humans lived in the middle world, and through ceremony, they could commune with other realms. This is believed to be the reason that they would have built mounds, would have been to more closely reach the upper realm. The upper realm was important because there was a figure commonly depicted as the Birdman, who appears in many pieces of art, and is thought to be the same character from a surviving myth known today as the Red Horn Cycle. This is a storytelling tradition that still exists among Native people. Also, there was a great serpent, sometimes depicted as wings, that is also believed to predate the Mississippian. Due to the similarities of art styles, it was once thought the Southeast Ceremonial Complex arrived from southern Mesoamerican cultures, especially when you think about some common themes like a winged serpent. But today this is largely discredited. Of course, doubtless, though, there was some cultural exchange that took place. The surviving art that we have today includes stone-carved figures, very ornate ceramics, and engraved copper and shell pieces. These were traded extensively over networks which connected Florida to the Great Lakes and Texas to the Appalachians. Middle Tennessee lay at the heart of these trading networks and seems to have been a hub for pottery production for the entire region. One of the best surviving mounds that we have in the area, if we want to give an example for what a large mound area in Middle Tennessee would have looked like, is today called Pinson Mounds. It's named for the first white land speculator to cluelessly stumble on the site. Pinson Mounds probably predates the Mississippian, more than likely, but it still gives a good idea of what a large town would have looked like. It covers 400 acres, and has 17 mounds in a geometric enclosure with designated areas for residential dwellings and large central plazas as well. The tallest mound stands 72 feet high and is aligned with Mound 28 on the summer solstice sunrise and Mound 29 on the equinox sunrise. Today it's called Saul's Mound, this highest mound in the complex, and it has since been retrofitted with a staircase, making it easier than ever for sacred sites to be walked on by tourists.
Okay.
Okay. So the Mississippian inhabitants of Middle Tennessee also developed a unique burial style that distinguished it from the surrounding areas, and it was so unique that they were thought to be a separate race of people altogether by early white settlers. They were called the Stone Grave people. A man called Joseph Jones in his 1876 manuscript Explorations of the Aboriginal Remains of Tennessee noted that they practiced cranial deformation to elongate the skull.
Oh, okay. Never mind. I'm just gonna sound really uneducated. Never mind.
Very common actually in many cultures across the world if you were about to...
Yes, I remember hearing about it when we were in Mexico. The Mayan people did that too as well. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, they found some examples, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's Samarkand, they actually found some examples too. So the Mississippian people place their dead in stone slabbed lined graves within large mortuary areas. There was another 19th century researcher, Mr. Gates P. Thruston, that's quite a name, isn't it? Who argued in his 1890s work, The Antiquities of Tennessee and Adjacent States, that the cemeteries and mound structures in the Nashville area were so sophisticated that only a non-native superior race, read between the lines here, white, could have built these structures and lived in the area before disappearing.
Okay.
Yeah, this conspiracy theory was common at the time for any indigenous peoples that were deemed too advanced and kind of functioned as a 19th century version of ancient aliens theory.
Cool.
Yeah, Atlantis did it.
Okay.
So as the 14th century began to draw to a close, Cahokia and several other northern sites began to enter a period of decline. And again, without written records, the variety of explanations for this proposed by scholars can vary widely. There's climate change, deforestation, localized civil unrest, outside invasion. Further south, though, in Middle Tennessee, towns and villages did begin to build more defensive structures, like walls, palisades. Mound building itself slowed, and trade did become more localized. So these long-distance trade networks I was talking about earlier weren't quite as active as they had been. And this trend continued into the 15th century, and while the region was definitely in what we might call today an economic downturn, it wasn't what you would call like a societal collapse or anything. They were still continuing their way of life, just more localized. And this is evident again by the Natchez people, who were still continuing to build mounds even after contact with Europeans.
So what are the mounds?
Again, that depends on who you ask. They seem to serve a variety of purposes. There's the religious explanation that they could be a ceremonial site that was closer to the upper world. You know, the suggestion that because these mounds align astronomically, that you could stand on top of them and be able to measure seasons and time, which if you're in an agrarian society is very important to know when to plant your crops. It's also just a way to set a place in your town that can be seen by all the residents, that is then understood to be the town center, the most important town. It can also just exist just by symbolism of being higher than all the other dwellings in the town, just to be a centralized symbol of the community.
So it varies.
It varies depending on site, period, and also seems to vary depending on who you ask.
Okay.
So ultimately, what happened to these people? Now we need to head back to Europe again. We're going to go back to those Viking descendants in Western Europe. They're now called the Norsemen, and they're a militarized noble class that started to find work as mercenaries in the Iberian Peninsula as part of the Reconquista. In return, they are frequently offered captured land that was once occupied by the Moors, and in search of fame and glory, other groups of people followed from across Europe into modern-day Spain. Once the last Muslim city of Granada fell to Ferdinand and Isabel in 1492, suddenly the prospect of a large militarized but now unemployed population of young men could obviously prove destabilizing for a young nation, as is evident by civil unrest in many parts of the world today. This is where Christopher Columbus comes into the story.
Great.
By searching for a trade route to bypass the Ottomans, who had been allied with the Moors, who they had just been at war with, he stumbled into the place that Spain would end up sending all these young men.
He just failed upwards, the definition of failing upwards.
Yep. So, of course, we all know the story. Aided by the horses they were riding and the, steel weapons they had and the diseases that followed with them, waves of these conquistadors raced across the Atlantic, driven by bloodlust and insatiable greed, and the calamity that followed is known all too well. You have Cortez plundering the Aztecs, followed by Cortez's second cousin, Pizarro, with the Inca, and it's here, working under Pizarro, that we actually meet Hernando de Soto. So Hernando de Soto was born in the Spanish region of Extremadura just a few years after the conquest of Granada. Hernando's parents were likely a poor noble class known as hidalgos. This status meant that they were likely exempt from taxes, but also had little to no land.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah.
What a trade.
The rocky and arid land of Extremadura is now home to some of Spain's most beautiful national parks, but at the time it was known for being poor, rocky, and arid in the summertime, sometimes unsuitable for farming in places. And it was also home to Cortez and Pizarro. In fact, it was one of the leading regions that the conquistadors came from. De Soto found work as a public official in Nicaragua, where he became known and received praise for his ruthless extortion of local villages.
Good, okay.
Yep. He was recruited by Pizarro, and De Soto was one of the last Incan Emperor Atahualpa's captors in the city of Cuzco. After Atahualpa was murdered, De Soto became a lieutenant governor in the city. He returned to Spain in 1536, now a very rich man off plundered gold, but could not find peace there. I know, poor man. Inspired by stories of the castaway Cabeza de Vaca, correct me if I'm wrong on my Spanish there, he asked King Charles for a governorship position, but was instead tasked with the conquest of North America for Spain within 4 years in return for a share of the land.
I'm sorry, what? What? I don't know what part of that sentence is more outrageous. I really don't.
By all metrics, De Soto's expedition would be a complete disaster. In 1539, 620 men boarded 7 royal ships and 7 caravels owned by De Soto. They brought with them 237 horses and 200 pigs, along with heavy armor and equipment. This was all for their planned 4-year conquest of an entire continent.
So with like 200 horses and so many pigs, they're going to conquer North America.
They seem to assume that, like Cortez and Pizarro, they were going to find a large, unpopular regime in the center of the continent and be able to get dissenting tribes to ally with them to assist in their overthrow. For example, Pizarro showed up in Peru right after there had been a civil war.
And they're going to do this by riding pigs into battle.
So, after landing in Florida, they immediately set about terrorizing the local population, as these conquistadors did wherever they went. But on hearing what the Spanish really wanted was gold, the native people soon realized they could get rid of these men by telling stories of huge sums of gold that existed just far enough away in the north.
That's clever. Just be like, hey, just ride those pigs until it gets a little chilly, and then there's gold there. Stay there. Just ride the pigs to Canada.
So, after wintering in Florida, the expedition headed north through modern-day Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina without finding any gold.
They didn't go far enough north.
No.
They still gotta go.
They never reached the Golden State, Delaware.
Yeah, you gotta hit Nova Scotia. Keep going.
As they traveled, their escaped pigs went feral. Which was actually horrible for the native people because they ravaged indigenous agriculture. And in South Carolina today, feral pigs are still a problem.
Yeah, you can get attacked by a pig in
Yeah.
South Carolina.
Yep.
And it's all because these people just like improperly rode their pigs to find gold. I'm sorry, I'm tangenting. I'm just picturing them riding pigs. I know they didn't ride the pigs.
It's fair to make this expedition wasn't epic. Like, no one won in the story.
I think that people who were like, go north, you'll find gold. There's tons of gold there. They sound like winners to me.
Yeah.
They won that interaction.
Yeah, they won that round. They did win that round. So after searching for gold for a month in the mountains of North Carolina, DeSoto turned west into modern-day Tennessee. And it's here that he began to encounter much heavier resistance from the local Mississippian peoples because he is raiding their lands, showing up and just demanding food.
Yeah, he lost all his pigs.
Claiming to be a god, which is obnoxious on
Claiming
so
to be a
many
god
levels.
and he doesn't even have any pigs.
Now, one of these Mississippian leaders named Tuscaloosa, city is named after his name today, he devised a trap for the marauding conquistadors. When DeSoto confronted Tuscaloosa to demand provisions, Tuscaloosa said, hey, there's nothing here, but one of my villages just a few miles down, they've got plenty to spare. So DeSoto and his men moved ahead to the village. It's pronounced various ways I saw online, but I'm going to go with the pronunciation Mabilla. However, I've seen Mavilla, like a Maubilla. I've seen various pronunciations. Now, when the Spanish arrived, they found the village was completely filled with warriors and no children were on the site. They walked inside the palisade. Tuscaloosa arrived behind them and demanded that the Spanish leave.
They just asked them to leave?
Yeah, they asked them to leave. Of course, a fight broke out. Realizing they were being ambushed, the Spanish fled, leaving their provisions in the town. They returned with their guns to burn the village, and in the ensuing battle, 200 conquistadors were killed, along with most of the defending warriors. So, though the Spanish had technically won the battle, they had done so at huge cost themselves, losing almost a third of their men, a quarter of their horses, and most of their supplies. DeSoto was terrified that news of this would reach Spain, and he would be embarrassed before the king.
He would be embarrassed.
So,
okay.
So he decided to turn away from his resupply ships that were sitting on the Gulf Coast and instead head deeper into Mississippian territory. In fact, he
knows he's not going north anymore, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because they said gold was north. He's still got a lot of north to go.
He didn't seem to know where he was going because he soon ended up heading more west and found himself blocked in by the Mississippi River. It was here that DeSoto fell ill and died in 1542. Since he had claimed to be a god to the native peoples, his men under him were terrified of what would happen when they realized that DeSoto was dead. So they weighed him down with rocks and sank his body into the river.
They were just...
Yep. They fled south to Mexico, where they knew that there were Spanish garrisons. Along the way, they continued to be attacked and hounded and chased out of the region. By the time that they returned to Mexico, only 311 of the original 620 were still alive. So, even though indigenous peoples had managed to force this set of conquistadors out, unfortunately, the disaster of De Soto's misadventures was only just beginning. They had brought with them European diseases, and these spread rapidly through the densely populated towns, and from there were launched further afield by the trade networks that existed across the continent. Facing death if they stayed in their population centers, most chose to spread out, increasing the distance the disease would have to travel. As people moved and mingled, many of the familiar tribal identities we know today from history were cemented. A good example of this is the Cherokee, who speak an Iroquoian language, which is thought to have originated in the Great Lakes region, but they still share the oral traditions of other Mississippian people, which suggests some kind of mixing between peoples that occurred at the time as this movement happened. It was this decentralized culture that the French and English would encounter in modern-day Middle Tennessee. So I do want to stop here and make it clear that although the peoples had moved out of their towns and villages at this time, they were still the same people. They were still the same people. They might have mixed and moved around a little bit, but
Like they had the same cultural identity?
Yeah, and their stories remained the same, and they still understood that it was their land.
Okay.
This was not, as 19th century thinkers thought, it was not some mysterious group of people who just disappeared one day. They were the same people.
Okay.
The modern-day Cherokee, Chickasaw, the Natchez people, all these can, and many others, all these can still claim descent from the Mississippian culture. So the French were the first Europeans to arrive in what is today Nashville proper. Unlike the Spanish, who were looking for gold, the French were fur traders. This was a century and a half after De Soto. In about 1710, Jean du Charleville arrived from New Orleans. I hope you like my French accent there. It was terrible in every way. He arrived to establish a trading post, which he was permitted to build on an abandoned mound at the confluence of the Cumberland and Big Lick Creek.
I'm sorry, who permitted him to?
Would have been the local Cherokee and Chickasaw.
Okay.
That was the name that they called themselves at the time. At this point in time, I can actually give names of these tribes as they called themselves, because this is where that we have records written by Europeans.
Okay, and what year is this again?
1710.
Okay.
So 150 years after De Soto, so the population at this point in time has decentralized. There's been some overgrowth on some of the mound sites. Being permitted to build a trading post on a former mound has led some to believe that the Cherokee and Chickasaw might have not been the original inhabitants on that plot of land, for that they might have, come from like maybe a few miles down the road, because typically allowing for the desecration of such a sacred space would have provoked immediate attack. For this lone fur trader to show up and build his trading post on a mound, if the people there had been the ones who built the mound, it's thought that they would not have allowed that. They would have killed him. By all measures, the French seem to have had a decent relationship, though, with the peoples in the region. They continued to trade, and the area became known as French Lick.
Gross.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know
like
why
it.
settlers kept on calling places Lick. I understand it has to do with salt deposits, but it's just not a good name. Why did you do it? All the while that this was happening, though, changes were occurring in the wider world. Spain's influence was waning, and now the British, whose monarchs, interestingly enough, were also descended from those Vikings through their Norman founder, William the Conqueror, wanted their own slice of colonialism pie. Across the Appalachian Mountains on the Atlantic seaboard, these new British colonizers, they didn't want gold or fur, they wanted land. And a series of brutal ethnic conflicts had broken out and already decimated the populations east of the Appalachian Mountains. For native peoples, though, these colonizers looking for land, and their doctrine of manifest destiny meant that it was not enough for them to show up and steal from you or enslave you or force you to convert to their religion. No, this meant that anywhere they wanted, you could no longer exist. So it's a different kind of fight altogether now. This is where we run back into Mr. James Robertson, the man whose obelisk stands in Centennial Park, credited with founding Nashville and bestowing civilization on the land, and here he enters the story and brings it into its final chapters. So back in London, Parliament had established the Proclamation Line of 1763. This was because they were reeling from the costly French and Indian War, and they were tired of paying to send troops to defend the colonists every time that they were faced with a land dispute with indigenous peoples. By doing this, Parliament had limited the settlement of Anglo-Americans to east of the Continental Divide. This infuriated local land speculators who had been hoping to make a fortune selling newly acquired French territory from the war. One of these angry men was a North Carolinian named James Robertson.
No, he's also from North Carolina.
He's also from North Carolina.
Oh, just North Carolina abounds in this episode.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was North Carolina when it was founded.
What?
Tennessee was North Carolina originally. It was just Western North Carolina. And then North Carolina ceded that land to the federal government, and the federal government made a new state of Tennessee. That's why That's why if you look at it on a map, North Carolina and Tennessee's northern boundary is just a straight line with Kentucky and Virginia. Because Virginia once was also West Virginia and Kentucky too. Yeah, and North Carolina was North Carolina and what is today Tennessee.
Why didn't I learn that in North Carolina history, in the 8th grade? Why didn't they tell us that?
That's a good question. Well, because
do we just not want to claim we don't want to claim Tennessee. We learn all about South Carolina, but we don't want to claim Tennessee? Okay.
Yeah, that's Anyway, so in 1775, during the upheaval of colonial revolt in the East, Mr. Robertson and his fellow wannabe con man, Richard Henderson, met a Cherokee delegation and signed the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, which ceded control of most of Tennessee and Kentucky to what was called the Transylvania Company. Notice they did this during the American War for Independence. They chose a very convenient time. It was also called the Treaty of Watauga, the namesake of the lake in Centennial Park. This treaty also held no legal ground because the colonial delegation had no authorization to make treaties with foreign entities on behalf of the governments of North Carolina, Virginia, or Britain. The native peoples quickly realized that they had been scammed. This is where a Cherokee war leader called Dragging Canoe enters the picture, and he encouraged his people to refuse to accept the treaty and resist invasion. He formed a breakaway nation called the Chickamauga Cherokee. They fought a war of attrition with the settlers. Unfortunately, though, for Dragging Canoe, shortly after that he tried to fight back, Britain chose to end its war in the American colonies. It granted independence because it didn't want to pay the money to fight a prolonged insurgency across an ocean. Without the British Army enforcing a proclamation line, American colonists now streamed into indigenous lands faster than ever before. After attacks on Chickamauga Cherokee towns by frontiersmen in 1779 and the United States military in 1782, the resistance found it difficult to continue. In Middle Tennessee, Mr. James Robertson established Fort Nashboro at the site of French Lick. Settlers poured into the area with their slaves and immediately began plowing the land and establishing plantations. Meanwhile, the surviving native peoples were forced into the southwest corner of the state around modern-day Chattanooga. They were named the Five Civilized Tribes and promised that if they westernized and became like Americans, they would be left to live in peace. Of course, this was a lie. Once elected president, plantation owner Andrew Jackson, a local to Nashville, passed the Indian Removal Act through Congress, and even though this act was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, Andrew Jackson's racist hatred was so great that he acted unilaterally and ordered the military to round up the five tribes and forced them on a march to present-day Oklahoma. This act today is known as the Trail of Tears. An estimated 4,000 Choctaw, 3,500 Creek, 800 Chickasaw, and 4,000 Cherokee died. Andrew Jackson got his face printed on the 20 and is still considered a hero by many white Americans to this day.
Yeah, you can go get married on his plantation over there in Hermitage. Yeah, fun, cool.
I'd like to make it clear, though, that Native people never stopped resisting. To this day, the Eastern Band of Cherokee has managed to survive in western North Carolina. However, for many that escaped capture, they lost their federally recognized status, and they were forced to integrate and give up their identities. In Nashville, the mounds, village sites were leveled, the burial sites were cleared, grave robbers moved in and plundered the sites. The mound on which the French trading post once stood is now under the Bicentennial Mall. The French Lick Creek, where that flowed nearby, was converted into a closed underground sewer.
Ugh.
Yeah, it runs from about Vanderbilt University and empties out to Cumberland at Germantown. They've actually got a few of those. A few closed sewers that were originally creeks. However, to this day, Nashville homeowners are often surprised to find human remains in their basement, crawl spaces, and flower beds.
Wait, what?
No joke.
No, seriously?
No joke. In 2015, they found remains in one of the largest known burial sites in Nashville, which is called Knoll Cemetery. It is located below the modern-day 12 South neighborhood, and this massive area stretched from modern-day Sevier Park down to Lipscomb University between Leland Lane and Granny White Pike.
Ugh.
Yep, that was where the remains were discovered. I believe it was 2015. If you visit the area today, you will find a large monument to the Civil War Battle of Nashville, but no mention of how the site was once sacred burial ground.
Yeah, that's just like the suburbs with a Christian college over there with like little hipster coffee shops. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And this unfortunately follows a pattern from the government of rather callously leveling ancient sites with a casual disregard that almost makes this erasure of history seem deliberate.
I mean, I think you can go ahead and... It's deliberate. It's very deliberate. That's why you never learn in school about indigenous people tricking people and outsmarting like DeSoto and stuff. Like, these people didn't win because they were so clever. They won because they didn't understand how disease works.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the government does have a motive. The government can plausibly deny that a crime took place by destroying all the evidence, then they can forever not have to deal with any justice. They can say they did some bad things, but they were young and they had so much promise, They can claim that they deserve to be, given undying love and adulation and be a shining light to the world. There's a Wikipedia article listing cultural genocides by continent. It's not the most extensive list, but it's fairly thorough. It includes, among others, China's rule over Tibet, the occupation of Ireland by the British, and the Armenian genocide at the hands of Turkey. I need to mention, though, that as of the day that we are recording this, the only entry for North America is Canada.
Okay.
Other known Nashville sites that have been destroyed include, but are not limited to, Traveler's Rest, Stones River, White Spend, Myatt Drive, Cockrell Bend, Cleese's Ferry, Bell's Bend, Under Old Hickory Lake, and in very recent memory, the Charlotte Pike Walmart.
What?
Earthen remains, of a village known as Gordontown were leveled to make way for the Hemmingwood subdivision in the mid-'80s. And along Brickchurch Pike, at least 4 large mounds were destroyed in the 80s to make way for a housing subdivision and a Baptist church. The passage of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act has done the bare minimum to ensure the integrity of human remains, but not the sites themselves. The Nashville Predators, for example, are named for the remains of a saber-toothed tiger that was found alongside human remains. This is where that I'd like to bring back the Parthenon, which to this day stands claiming to be a, symbol of the history of Nashville. And it claims to represent that it has some historical connection to this land, despite the irony that it is built on a land that has already had its history erased. Which leads us to the East Bank site, known today as East Nashville. It appears in the testimony of John Haywood. Remember him from earlier. He was one of the earliest to write about the area in his Natural and Aboriginal History of Tennessee. He is quoted that the mound formerly standing within the limits of North Nashville was carefully examined by Mr. Earl in 1821, and that to a certain extent, the structure was similar to that of the mound which I explored directly across the opposite bank of the Cumberland, read East Nashville. Thus, in a small mound about 100 feet in diameter and about 10 feet high, which I explored on the eastern bank of the Cumberland River, opposite the city of Nashville from across the mouth of the Lick Branch, at the foot of a large mound which had apparently been used as a residence site of a temple. Graves also extended to the river's edge, many of which are uncovered from time to time by the crumbling of the sandy bank. About 50 yards higher up the Cumberland, and evidently connected with the previous mounds described, are two smaller mounds, about 40 feet in diameter and about 4 feet high. Now, the original houses on East Bank were destroyed by a fire in 1916. Several feet of fill were brought into the area, and it was turned into an industrial site. In 1991, graves were discovered while working on the Jefferson Street Bridge, and then work on the modern-day Nissan Stadium required all soil to be removed down to bedrock. They claimed that no graves were found, but you also have to ask the question, was anyone really looking that hard while operating huge machinery on a time limit to construct a massively expensive building?
For the NFL.
The creek opposite Big Lick has also been turned into a closed sewer. It runs roughly under Ellington Parkway and Frederick Douglass Park. It starts at Apex Street, which is where McFerrin goes under Ellington Parkway. It's the creek mentioned that the mounds and graves follow up. So actually following the geography from the described account, yes, East Nashville was actually built on ceremonial and burial ground.
Oh. Wow. That's pretty upsetting.
So, as the story now goes full circle, that brings me to my understanding of hauntings and the supernatural. I believe that ghosts are things that humans create. They are shadows, cultural, the physical things that we leave behind, and they're what remains when the more comfortable world that we've built around us goes dark. Suddenly we're forced to see familiar things with no light.
Wow. That's it. That's all I have is wow.
Okay, that's kind of all I have too. That was the first episode.
That was a lot. That was a lot. Just went straight for it. Just called out government conspiracy theories and genocide, and just right out the gate. Okay.
I'm glad that we picked this topic because I now feel like I know and understand the history of the place I live much better, and I'm glad that I was able to hear your story too, because without even knowing that what I was researching was going to relate to you, somehow we found two topics that both hit the same cultural myth that exists today.
Yeah, that was interesting. I would like to have gone more into the locals theorizing about the Wells land being cursed because of someone's honking outside now. Okay. I would like to have gone more into the local myth that the Wells built on what was mounds and or burial ground, but unfortunately, like you said, I couldn't find a lot of information other than whoever had settled there pre-1800s. All I found was it was likely the Mississippian people, but I couldn't find any information on the Red River area. And that's just always what people say. It's just like, oh, your house is haunted? Well, must be a burial ground.
And as for me personally, I'd like to look further into surviving stories that still exist.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to look into surface level things, say this is what the archaeologists have found, this is what the written records say, but I'd like to actually delve deeper into the passed down stories that still exist today as to the meanings of the sites and the symbolism of their artifacts and how that they relate to their worldview and how they see the cosmos.
Mm-hmm. That would be interesting. Interesting to do for one. Okay, well, we made it. Episode 1. All the way through. With lots of mishaps along the way. If you stuck around, thank you. And I'm sorry. We'll get better.
Thank you.
And we'll be back for episode 2. What's our topic for episode 2?
Episode 2, I am researching Kentucky, going to the state just to the north of us, and the history of the cultural association with the large cave systems that exist there.
Oh. Okay, then. All right, so I guess...
What about you?
I'm just going to make it a surprise.
Oh.
I mean, by the time this comes out, you'll already be able to see the episode 2 title, and you'll know what I covered, but... For you, it's a surprise.
No, I didn't know it was supposed to be.